Now we're going to head to El Salvador, where back in February, the president announced he was moving thousands of high-ranking gang members to the country's new so-called mega jail.
This is the video the president of El Salvador wants people to see. His prison guards manhandling inmates.
A detention center the size of 7 football stadiums with capacity to hold 40,000 prisoners, the largest of its kind in Latin America.
January 31st, 2023, El Salvador flung open the gates of hell as President Nayib Bukele authorized the arrest and detention of over 60,000 gang members, many of whom once held the nation in a stranglehold of violence.
Ustedes desatan una ola de criminalidad y nosotros quitamos la comida en las cárceles.
They're now locked away in the country's infamous mega prison, where human rights are an extinct concept. Inmates here are subjected to extreme measures far more brutal than most could imagine. But while this approach may be keeping El Salvador safe, it carries a hidden cost that's slowly eroding the nation's economy. So, what drove President Bukele to such extremes? What's life really like inside this mega prison? And most importantly, what future does this hold for a country caught between justice and survival? Well, brace up, because how El Salvador destroyed their brutal gangs is definitely worse than you think.
Every country, I think, has their own problems. I would guess that probably our approach, that is very, very popular with the people, has a problem. And the problem is that it has common sense.
In El Salvador, it's estimated someone is murdered every hour. It could become the world's most violent country, if not already.
El Salvador has been known as the murder capital of the world. Just to get an idea, in 2015, the murder rate in El Salvador was higher than any country on earth.
October 2015, El Salvador's streets ran red with blood, recording over 900 homicides in a single month. On average, this meant that 29 lives were lost every single day in a country with a population of just over 6.3 million people, which is a couple of millions less than the population of New York City alone. This deadly toll was fueled by a wave of terror, unleashed by the violent rivalry between two of the country's most feared criminal gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18. Their brutal feud was extracting an unimaginable price on the nation. The violence was as senseless as it was massive, but its fundamental cause can be traced to where it all began: the United States.
In the United States now, a U.S. university has sued the CIA to force it to release classified documents over war crimes committed in El Salvador.
Salvadorans are among the largest groups of undocumented immigrants deported from the U.S.
During the Salvadoran Civil War from 1979 to 1992, the United States took an active role in training Salvadoran civilians for Central America's notorious death squads. From the get-go, the U.S. knew these forces were involved in assassination activities, yet they continued to fund them until 1989. The only reason why the aid from the U.S. was cut off was that a prominent priest was murdered by one of these assassins, prompting the U.S. government to feign surprise and act as if they had just only realized they were, in fact, assassins. During this time, the first wave of large-scale migration from Central America to the U.S. took place. Keep in mind that gang violence wasn't even an issue back then. Yet the U.S. was financially supporting the very war that forced these people to flee their homes in search of refuge, and it was their settlement on American soil that formed the very first Salvadoran gangs. I mean, these guys were all alone in Southern California and LA amongst several ethnic communities, so of course they had to form some gang-like group to protect themselves. Now this group would later be called Mara Salvatrucha, and they would get involved in numerous violent conflicts against the Chinese and blacks. The Mara Salvatrucha lived by the words, "Vivo por mi madre, muero por mi barrio," which loosely translates to, "I live for my mother, I die for my neighborhood." That phrase signified their commitment to defending themselves from outsiders who occasionally infiltrated their community, stole their property, and assaulted their women. As gang violence became uncontrollable in Los Angeles, the U.S. government decided it was time for a mass deportation. Starting in 1989, the U.S. began deporting young men with gang ties or criminal records back to El Salvador. This was especially destabilizing for a country trying to get back up from a decade-long civil war, a war that had left behind a traumatized population facing widespread poverty, fragile social conditions, and countless orphans, with around 4,000 deported individuals arriving, many of whom had been trained in gang organization in Southern California. El Salvador simply couldn't deal with the large influx of gang members. On the other hand, these returning gang members came back to a country with severe economic and social challenges. Family structures had crumbled, and financial and cultural stability were deeply shaken. In addition to that, El Salvador's new national police force, formed under the peace accords and composed of former military and guerrilla members, were too weak to handle the emerging gang problem effectively. So with no reintegration policies or psychological support in place, these individuals were left to fend for themselves in all the chaos. Plus, the lack of government rehabilitative programs led to neglect amongst the youth, fostering a predatory mindset. And as violence became normalized, gangs turned increasingly toward criminal activities, with extortion becoming a cornerstone of their operations. This would set the stage for El Salvador's messiah, Nayib Bukele, to step in and wipe them out, but not before thousands of lives had already been lost.
Together, we're going to restore safety to our streets and peace to our communities. And we're going to destroy the vile criminal cartel MS-13 and many other gangs.
Most of the crime in El Salvador has been attributed to two of its largest criminal organizations, the Mata Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13, and the 18th Street Gang, or Barrio 18. Now, these are the predominant gangs currently occupying the country's mega prison built by Nayib Bukele. And if you're curious as to why that's so, then listen carefully, because this is how it went down. The name Mata Salvatrucha was combined from the words Mata, meaning gang, Salva, referencing Salvador, and Trucha, which roughly translates to street smart. The number 13 reflects the position of the letter M in the alphabet. MS-13 has been accused of targeting economically disadvantaged and at-risk youth for recruitment, with initiation rites requiring new members to endure a violent 13-second beating, as well as getting wet, which simply means committing a crime, mostly murder, on behalf of the gang. As tough as this may sound, leaving the gang is just as horrendous, suicidal if you wish, as getting in. You can spot these gangs by their distinctive chest tattoos, which serve as a lifelong marker of their allegiance to that gang. In 2008, an FBI threat assessment estimated that MS-13 had around 6,000 to 10,000 members in the U.S. alone, establishing them as one of the country's most significant criminal organizations. Now, Barrio 18, meanwhile, is just as dangerous, if not more ruthless. Like MS-13, they originated from LA, California, as a faction of the notorious Clanton 14 gang. At first, Barrio 18's various groups, known as cliques, were mostly made up of Mexican immigrants. They controlled neighborhoods like MacArthur Park, within central LA's Koreatown area. And as part of their rules, members of the gang must adhere to strict regulations, and any form of disobedience toward a gang leader or a fellow member can lead to an 18-second beatdown, or, for more serious offenses, execution. Gang members often wear sports gear with the number 18 and have distinctive tattoos just like their rivals. Their colors, blue and black, respectively pay homage to the Mexican mafia and reflect the gang's original color. Now, over time, the influence of these two major gangs grew stronger in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. They leveraged weakened governments and high levels of social exclusion in these countries to expand their criminal network. In particular, Barrio 18 systematically extorted El Salvador's public transit systems, drove out entire communities, and even managed to insert itself into political affairs. MS-13 also engages in a host of criminal activities involving murder, rape, abduction, arms and drug trafficking, and pretty much every crime you can think of. By 2016, these gangs had divided El Salvador into territories and established a presence in 247 of the country's 262 municipalities. To enter or leave these areas often require paying extortion fees, and businesses operating within gang territory were compelled to pay protection fees. The gangs enforced a strict code of silence on witnesses with violent threats. If anyone dared to report a crime to law enforcement, they'd not only punish them, but retaliate against their whole family by raping their women and killing their men. To point out just how bad things got, the violence in El Salvador was skyrocketing so high that it once recorded the highest murder rate in the world. In 2009, El Salvador was recording 71 homicides per 100,000 people. 2 years later, it was dethroned as the murder capital of the world by Honduras, which was also under the control of MS-13 and other Latin criminal syndicates. But in what seemed like the worst sport on earth, El Salvador reclaimed its #1 spot in 2015, recording a shocking 103 homicides per 100,000 people, the highest homicide rate ever recorded in the last century. Now, to make matters worse, around 39,000 gang members were estimated to be operational in El Salvador back in 2004, but by 2012, that number had tripled. These gangs, which at this point had morphed into fully fledged criminal syndicates, stretched their operations all the way to Europe, Africa, and then back to the US. They generated an annual revenue of approximately $31.2 million, with most of their income coming from drug trafficking and extortion. MS-13 in particular has been implicated in numerous high-profile cases, such as the infamous murder of 2 female high school students in New York, which was reportedly a revenge killing over a minor disagreement. Another case would involve the detention of 2 suspected members in Houston, Texas, charged with abducting and sexually assaulting 3 girls before killing them along a roadside. El Salvador was on the brink of collapse, edging towards self-destruction. But as we know now, President Nayib Bukele was the man who would come in and sweep out corruption without breaking a sweat. Now, while some of his laws might have been unconventional, it's unlikely he simply woke up one day and decided to transform the country. His sweeping reforms were the culmination of groundwork laid by more than 2 decades of prior administrations. Let's go back to June 2004, when President Saca launched the Super Mano Dura policy, giving the Salvadoran military authority to patrol gang-ruled areas, conduct random searches of suspected gang members, and arrest people solely based on appearance. This policy led to the arrest of around 4,000 gang members, causing overcrowding in El Salvador's prisons. By 2012, these gangs were seeking a truce, even though they would eventually break it that same year. That was just one of many instances, but the point here is, if these gangs were so tough and formidable, how exactly did Bukele destroy them?
El Salvador was turned from the most dangerous place in the world to the safest in the Western Hemisphere. That's not a small feat, and that's not done easily, and nobody in the world has ever done it before.
Well, the answer revolves around the type of person Bukele really was before he became president, and the violence he experienced while growing up. Born during the Salvadoran Civil War, Bukele was raised in San Salvador by his Palestinian father, who opened El Salvador's first McDonald's franchise, ran a textile company, helped build 4 mosques, and also operated a public relations firm in the country. Bukele, who has 3 brothers and 7 half-siblings, went to a bilingual private school. However, his political apprenticeship began after he dropped out of college and was managing a nightclub in downtown San Salvador. He took over his family's PR firm, whose key client was the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, aka FMLN. And yeah, that's the same FMLN group that engaged in the Salvadoran War against the country's armed forces. The presidency and the assembly, however, were controlled by the Alianza Republicana Nacionalista, or ARENA, which was founded in the early 80s by a member of a right-wing death squad. The party catered primarily to the business elite, but its members included ex-military men and religious conservatives. In 2009, an accumulation of corruption scandals sank the ARENA, allowing the FMLN to gain power, which it held onto for the next decade. Being that he had been in business with them, Bukele, through a couple of connections, launched a self-funded bid to become the mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, a municipality of El Salvador. He won the election, and due to the huge impact he created, the FMLN encouraged him to run for mayor of San Salvador, which he did. By this time, the FMLN was soiling his political future with their shady past, at which point Bukele was forced to cut him off and start a new party, the party that led him to become the president. June 1st, 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected as the 43rd president of El Salvador. He became the youngest head of state in Latin America and embodied a new national beginning. Now, his first step to eradicating these gangs was to negotiate a peace treaty, as reported by a local newspaper in the country called El Faro. But here's the thing. Less than a week after that story was published, Bukele announced that the government would investigate El Faro for money laundering. I mean, yeah, it sounds weird, but ever since then, he's attacked that newspaper relentlessly, sometimes calling out journalists by name. Some of them have been forced into exile, while many others have taken to leaving the country after publishing a story, waiting until the threats settle down before they return. The newspaper has a strong international following, but within El Salvador, Bukele's campaign against it has made an impact. A lot of people now view El Faro as biased and untrustworthy. On top of that, the Salvadoran National Assembly passed a questionable law to block news outlets from reporting on the gang situation. Journalists could face up to 10 years in prison if they reproduced or transmitted information that might have come from gang sources or could otherwise panic the public. Now, why did Bukele make these laws, you ask? Well, it all boils down to the bigger plans he had to stop gang violence. In March 2022, MS-13 unleashed a wave of violence, killing 87 people in just 3 days. El Salvador has a violent past, but this massacre stood out for its sheer brutality. They targeted people with no connections to crime: a fruit seller, a surf instructor, a homemaker, a cobbler. Almost anyone was fair game. But this attack wasn't random. It was a ruthless message aimed at one person: President Nayib Bukele, who had vowed to cut crime drastically and transform El Salvador's image. The gang left bodies along the road to Surf City, Bukele's newly renovated beachfront area meant to attract international tourism. The horrifying spree grabbed headlines around the world, and it pushed Bukele to take a hard-line response. So Bukele's crackdown starts off with a state of emergency. He implemented policies that mixed the rival gang members in prison, a tactic avoided in the past to prevent violence behind bars. Authorities arranged hundreds of prisoners, bare-chested and tightly packed together in rows, in photos meant to intimidate other gang members. He also enacted extreme legal measures, all under the guise of democracy. New policies would strip rights like legal defense and freedom of movement, loosening the rules on arrests, and even authorizing state surveillance of civilian communications.
Includes that arrests can be made without a warrant, and detainees no longer have a right to a lawyer. Private communications of all citizens can also be accessed by the government.
Under these new laws, security forces launched a swift and aggressive assault on gangs, apprehending members and suspected associates without warrants or solid evidence, significantly speeding up the process compared to previous crackdowns by other presidents. To put it into context how effective this crackdown was, El Salvador recorded 33,000 arrests in the first months. This is in addition to the fact that the state of emergency had suspended constitutional rights to legal defense, allowing authorities to grab people indefinitely on vague charges without the necessity of an arrest warrant or supporting evidence. Detainees were denied the right to a court hearing within 72 hours of arrest, and lawyers and civil society organizations report being unable to communicate with those detained. These arrests are now often based on unverified intelligence, rumors, and information sourced out from unusual places like social media profiles. Additionally, the Bukele administration has enacted new laws aimed at keeping gang members incarcerated for longer periods. Jail sentences have been heightened for gang affiliation, and the option of house arrest for individuals associated with these gangs is no longer an option. But if you think that's crazy, then we gotta tell you, inside Bukele's mega prison is a hell of a lot worse. We have the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, or CCOT, located in Tekaluka, which is a max security prison designed specifically for housing high-ranking and notoriously dangerous gang members. And not so surprisingly, those who enter CCOT seldom, if ever, see freedom again. Inside CCOT, masked guards watch closely as tattooed shirtless inmates are shuffled into overcrowded cells. Harsh, artificial lights add to the tense atmosphere, filled with fear and the constant threat of violence. This place is massive, built to hold around 40,000 people, about twice the number that would fill Madison Square Garden. Inmates are often transported in tightly packed buses. Their heads are shaved and hands bound behind their backs, underscoring the strict control enforced here. In a powerful scene, we have rows of prisoners crouching forward with their heads down, watched intently by armed guards. The visuals paint a picture of dehumanization, where prisoners endure cramped conditions, constant surveillance, and a setting that feels charged with aggression. CCOT offers no family visitation, rehabilitation programs, or classes to prepare prisoners for life after release. Occasionally, a select few prisoners, those deemed trustworthy, give motivational speeches to others, either lined up along their cell corridors or doing supervised exercise under the guards' strict watch. There's no access to the outside world. They remain indoors at all times. Each cell holds between 65 to 70 inmates, with steel catwalks above for guards to watch them from overhead. Now, the prison's not so bad. It has dining areas, recreation rooms, a gym, and even board games. But those are for the guards. With each cell set up for 100 inmates but equipped with just 2 sinks and 2 toilets, the conditions are only getting more strained as CCOT nears its 40,000 inmate capacity, isolated and tightly controlled by military police. These are the details we have shared by Nayib Bukele and his administration. Yet many journalists suspect that there's a far darker reality to the treatment of these inmates, and while we can only imagine the daily horrors they might face, it does raise the million-dollar question. Just how effective has Bukele's strategy truly been? Well, under President Bukele's leadership, El Salvador now holds the record for the highest incarceration rate worldwide, with roughly 2% of its adult population behind bars, according to the International Crisis Group. One of the biggest crackdowns was the disappearance of notorious gangs from MS-13 and Barrio 18 from neighborhoods that used to be their strongholds. Before this shift, people often needed gang permission to move through certain areas. If it was for a daily commute or even to get to the hospital, gangs used to control the local economy, deciding who could sell goods and where they could do it. Now many residents are at ease, no longer living under the constant watch of the gangs or have to follow the strict rules about crossing into neighboring communities. They've taken back their parks and public spaces, once dominated by gangs, and have started new community projects without any pushback from gang members for the first time in years. For example, we have inter-community soccer tournaments back in places like San Miguel and San Salvador, something that was nearly impossible before because of the gang's tight grip on territory. Now, while a few residents have noticed gang members returning to their neighborhoods, these individuals don't have nearly the same power they once did. Before the state of emergency, gangs mainly extorted those working for small and medium-sized businesses, including street vendors, shopkeepers, and people in transportation like buses and taxis. Gang extortion used to be based on perceived wealth, with the small vendors paying a few dollars each day and bigger businesses shelling out hundreds or even thousands each month. And sadly, those who couldn't keep up with the payments often faced violent consequences. Now, people in former gang-controlled areas told Insight Crime that they're no longer receiving threats or demands for money. Since the state of emergency began, many say that they haven't seen any sign of gang retaliation for missed payments. The transport sector, once a major target for extortion, has also seen a big change. Bus company operators in San Salvador shared with Inside Crime that gangs quickly stopped collecting fees in the days following the start of the crackdown. One bus company owner, who used to pay about $6,000 a month to 3 major gang groups, stopped paying MS-13 immediately after the emergency measures began, with payments to Barrio 18 soon fading away. This failure to continue their extortion schemes, which mainly targeted smaller informal businesses, has really been a major financial setback for the gangs. Police in El Salvador reported a 54% drop in extortion complaints from the start of the year through September 11th, compared to the same period in 2022. By that date, police had received 572 extortion complaints, with 299 cases naming MS-13 or Barrio 18 members as the culprits. This noticeable decline in gang-driven extortion was widely seen as a result of the state of emergency, which has significantly reduced the number of active gang members on the streets, with their usual foot soldiers and even family helpers arrested or hiding to avoid capture. Gangs have struggled to maintain the physical presence needed to keep up with extortion collections. But here's another question for you. If Bukele's approach is so effective, why hasn't the rest of Central America followed his lead? And what's the real price of this so-called crackdown for the people of El Salvador? President Bukele's harsh approach to dealing with gangs in El Salvador has stirred up a lot of debate. Some critics accuse him of serious human rights violations and undermining democracy, but others see his crackdown as a bold new model for tackling crime. You see, in 2023, El Salvador recorded a homicide rate of about 8 per 100,000, which was lower than the rate recorded in the US and El Salvador's lowest in history. And from the looks of it, Bukele's tough stance on crime has really struck a chord across Latin America. In nearby Guatemala and Honduras, people have organized pro-Bukele marches, and his visits have been met with cheers. Costa Rica's Security Minister Jorge Torres even suggested that his government should take inspiration from Bukele. Colombia's recent presidential runner-up, Rodolfo Hernandez, took a pre-election trip to San Salvador to see Bukele's methods in action. And far off in Chile, where crime rates are climbing, pro-Bukele street parades were going viral on social media. In essence, Bukele's critics in Latin America are relatively few. And when Ecuador's president Guillermo Lasso voiced some caution, saying Bukele might be going too far, his opinion was shut out like wildfire. In fact, polls suggested that Bukele is more popular among Ecuadorians than any of their own politicians. So despite the widespread support for his stance, adopting Bukele's approach would be a lot harder for any other Latin American country. You see, historically, Latin America has tried a variety of tactics in the fight against organized crime, often leading toward aggressive military-style approaches. In Colombia, for example, the government's all-out war against the Medellin cartel during the narco-terror period from 1984 to 93 unleashed a wave of bombings, assassinations, and large-scale violence. Mexico's former president Felipe Calderón launched a militarized offensive against the country's infamous cartels from 2006 to 2012, but by the end of his term, the murder rate had surged and remained high due to power struggles between criminal groups. On the flip side, less confrontational strategies like negotiating with criminal groups have sometimes shown a measure of success, but they're hardly foolproof. For instance, during the narco-terror era, Colombia tried negotiating with Pablo Escobar, the leader of the Medellin cartel. In exchange for an end to the bombings, Escobar received a reduced sentence and was allowed to build his own luxurious prison, complete with soccer fields and guards from his own crew. While this submission policy was viewed as humiliating in Colombia and abroad, it did temporarily reduce the murder rate between 1991 and 92. Mexico, too, has experimented with less confrontational approaches. Under its 70-year rule by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the government managed cartel violence by directly overseeing criminal operations through the Federal Security Directorate, Mexico's version of the FBI. Since the 2000s, Brazil offers another example. An informal agreement between law enforcement and the powerful gang First Capital Command, or the PCC, has turned Sao Paulo into one of the continent's safer cities. In each case, the consolidation of power under one or two criminal groups enabled these negotiations and kept inter-cartel violence in check. Now, one important thing you need to know is that Bukele's anti-gang campaign has put the country in serious debt. International monetary agencies estimate that by 2027, El Salvador might be putting 97.5% of its GDP on the line to keep up with these measures. Bukele has channeled billions of dollars into keeping security forces constantly on patrol, and also into salary payments for military and police. Now, another factor that makes the Bukele model only applicable to El Salvador is diversity. Countries like Guatemala and Honduras have much larger, more varied landscapes, and active civic groups that may not accept such aggressive policing. In places like Costa Rica, Panama, and possibly the Dominican Republic, institutions that uphold the rule of law might put limits on attempts to copy Bukele's strategies. Additionally, citizens themselves might resist. Like, let's be real, these gang members have brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers who wouldn't want them incarcerated without a fair trial. And even worse of all, Bukele's tactics haven't removed gang violence entirely. You see, according to official records, the administration's claim of arresting more than 50,000 MS-13 members and over 24,000 Barrio 18 members was exaggerated. Police data indicated that only 32,331 arrested individuals were confirmed gang members, while the rest were mostly suspected associates or under investigation. About 36% of known gang members and collaborators remain at large, adding up to more than 42,000 people. Plus, Bukele has faced allegations of laundering funds for Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro. One of his financial backers, Juan Luis Moreno, a Salvadoran businessman and former guerrilla leader who has supported Bukele's political campaigns, was also previously linked to arms trafficking for Colombia's FARC. So, can we really see Bukele's strategy working somewhere else? Maybe, but other countries risk copying El Salvador's darker outcomes rather than its achievements. The leaders who try might face chaos, as criminal groups multiply and use firepower to fight back, shrinking spaces for civil society and transparency, and leading to overcrowded prisons. For all its success in reducing crime, the Bukele model comes at a huge cost. If other leaders are willing to pay that price, it could lead to massive changes in the region's approach to fighting crime. And with Bukele recently securing a second term as president, his hardline methods are set to continue. The extended rule could mean an even harsher crackdown, raising concerns that in the years to come, things might get worse for El Salvador's civil rights and democracy.